The difference between the earlier sown crops and the later sown crops is bushel itself. So the later sown crops bushel seems to have slipped a little bit with them. Yields probably have slipped that little bit as well, but they're still holding up very well, Michael. You're still floating in around 3 tonne or a sliver weight. So again, like for late sown barley, if you're to look into the crystal ball and back in May and say you were going to be cutting 3 tonne with a May sown crop of spring barley, you would have been surprised. But yeah, things have turned out well for farmers, really, being honest with you. And again, a lot of us making malts, so you're seeing the bonus out of that as well in terms of price.
Substantial progress has been made with the harvest in the past week, but there's still a ways to go. Most farmers have a good idea of yields and potential return for the year. Comparison to the averages across your farm, your neighbours or your region is inevitable, and many would suggest necessary. Recording and maintaining good records of yields is a valuable routine for all farmers, and everyone should engage in this. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. With a significant proportion of most crops harvested, it's a great time to get a handle on yields so far this year. I'm delighted to be joined by 3 Teagasc Tillage Advisors from around the country: Conor O'Callaghan in Dublin, John Pettit in Wexford and Ciara O'Donovan in Cork. Conor, we might just focus on the winter crops first. What sort of yields have you been seeing in Dublin and that general region?
We had a terrible autumn followed by a lot of wet weather like a lot of the country had. So some of our plant stands weren't great, some of our crops weren't great, but we persisted with the better ones, and like that came through then to harvest. So winter barley were ranging from the low 3s to 4.2 tonnes per acre. Your average probably 3.5 tonnes there on the winter barley. They were cut relatively good moistures, so it wasn't too bad on that front. Straw wise, then the straw yield was back for around bales. It was only doing about maybe 8 bales to the acre, 8-9 bales per acre on that front. The winter oilseed rape, then that came quick enough after winter barley with the fine weather. We'd arranged there from little maybe under a tonne on some of the poor crops that just didn't branch, or parts of the field maybe were missing. That brought back the averages. So it ranged from a tonne to maybe 1.7, 1.9 in places, but they were rare. So you're averaging probably a tonne to a tonne and a half on the oilseed rape. But they were at good moistures with the weather that came after the winter barley. So the oilseed rape wasn't too bad. Back to the winter wheat then, I suppose, was the bulk of probably the main harvest, and it was a bit disappointing, to say the least. These crops that we thought would maybe compensate from the poor plant stands didn't really come to fruition. The last couple of weeks, they really turned and ripened very quick, which is not really a great sign to see on winter wheat. We just some of the crops that didn't even do 2 tonne in places, which was very disappointing. And a good crop of winter wheat in the northeast this year was doing 4 tonne, and that was a good crop. So like your average is back between maybe 3.2 to 3.4 winter wheat, which is very disappointing. But then again, whatever was cut, Michael, bushelled well. It did weigh well. So there were good bushels on that. So that's kind of where the 3 main winter crops.
From what I heard, Conor, winter oats for native area that was there was a bit of the star of the show. It seemed to do relatively well.
Did well. Winter oats, you're averaging around 4 tonne or a little bit more with it. For the area that was sown, wouldn't be hectic, but they were nearly the winner of the winter crops in the northeast.
Okay. And thanks Conor, shifting down a little bit further south down to Wexford, John Pettit, you're down there towards the bottom end of Wexford, and you had a very difficult time, I suppose, your farmers did, in terms of getting winter crops in. So there mightn't be too many of them, but in terms of average yields and that, how did it work out?
There was very little winter oats and very little winter barley sown, because the main focus was trying to get winter wheat into the ground, given the weather that farmers had to deal with. So again, winter oat wise, there was very, very, very small area winter oats went in again, but it yielded relatively well. So you're dealing with up on 3.5, 3.75 tonnes. Winter barley, winter barley was a disappointment. You were dealing with anything, and again, the area that went in was back considerably as well. But you're dealing anything between 2.5 to 3.5 tonnes, with an average something in the region of around 3.25. So winter barley was a big disappointment. Again, back to Conor's story, straw volumes were well back on it as well. And then winter wheat. Winter wheat actually looked quite well, but again, there was a nice. Most farmers would have had a percentage of winter wheat that was ploughed back up, and you would have put in an alternative spring crop because of misbits in the field and whatnot. But I suppose winter wheat actually looked better than what had actually performed. But generally, yields, Michael, you were dealing with anything between 3 and 4 ton, and 4 ton being the absolute best of it, with an average of something in around 3.5 ton. But that would have been as much as what was out there. So again, winter-wise, Michael, yields were a big disappointment for people.
Very disappointing for sure, yeah. And oilseed rape, you didn't mention that. Was there much of that at all, Zone?
There was a reasonable amount of rape went in, Michael, yeah. Obviously, it went in earlier, so there was a reasonable area of rape went in. But again, yields were very disappointing. There was some rape areas were ploughed up, again, because of misbits, or significant proportions of fields missing. But again, yields reported on a field-by-field basis, anything shy of a ton right up to about 1.8 ton. And you're dealing with averages probably something in around 1.4, 1.5 ton.
Again, relatively disappointing. There wouldn't be a lot of money left in that either, I suppose.
Nope, there would not be, Michael, no.
So, Ciara, just heading down to you. Ciara, you're down in the heart of Cork, and no more than John, farmers down there had a torrid time over the winter, and there probably wasn't a huge amount of winter crops. But for what was there, Ciara, what were you hearing as regards the yields of crops down there?
Yeah, so I know I surveyed a lot of my growers back along, but in fairness, actually a lot of them did plant what they had planned to plant in terms of winter cropping area. Now, probably winter oat area was certainly back on maybe normal years and back slightly, but winter barley, yeah, same story as the lads really there in terms of disappointing yields, probably averaging around 3.25 tons per acre, but like unfortunately a lot of reports of crops coming in sub 3 tons per acre. Look, there were some very good crops out there where you had full field and no missing patches, but crops were certainly thinner than normal, probably due to the prevailing weather conditions and the tough year that it had. No quality issues really. I think people were kind of happy enough with the bushel weights. And yeah, straw yields were back certainly. On the winter oilseed rape front, you probably have a cohort of growers there who've stuck with it. So the area sown is probably around the same as normal. Yields probably back a bit on the 5-year average locally here, but not doing too bad compared to that. Maybe we're kind of averaging 1.7, 1.8 tons per acre and caught it fairly low moisture. Tough to get the moistures down at the time with the weather conditions being a bit unfavourable, but not too bad. Winter wheat then, kind of averaging maybe around 4 tons an acre in this part of the world. Struggled a lot, I suppose, again with maybe missing patches out of fields being a major culprit in loss of yield potential in fields. No quality issues at all, but yeah, there was good crops out there, or better crops up at 4.5 tons an acre probably. No barn busters as this year. And just to finish up on the winter oats then, yeah, very small area planted here due to kind of the way the autumn weather was, but actually seems to be yielding quite well, maybe averaging about 3.5 tons an acre.
Okay, and just noticed actually, Ciara, John, and Conor, you might maybe all have a bit of a comment along the way, but noticed from some of the winter barley variety trials where it seemed to show that the BYDV tolerant winter barley seemed to have done a bit better going north than they did going south in terms of yield, which would signify that maybe BYDV might have been more of an issue further north. I start with Conor. Did you find that in winter wheats and winter barleys?
No, I wouldn't say that. Maybe marginally so. We had a lot of BYDV in the winter wheats this year because probably were sown before a lot of winter barley was sown. But maybe just marginally, maybe Michael, that would be all we'd see up this country on winter barley on that front.
Not a big issue in it. And John, you were commenting on that?
Joyo, Michael, as a variety was reported to have yielded that bit better. But again, Michael, to pick out differences between varieties this year would have been it's probably not fair to pass judgment on variety because there's so much variability in terms of missing bits in fields and the differential in yield between a heavy and a light soil type. Like you would have had winter barley drilled in some heavier soils. It would have had wet feet for a lot of winter. It's wouldn't have tillered to its true potential and so on. So yeah, there could be variation within varieties. People will report that the likes of Joy would have done well, but there's a lot of other variables there as well, Michael. So it's probably a little bit harsh to pass comment on variety. That's the one thing I'd say.
Ciara, I might just go back to you maybe, and maybe just swing back maybe to some of the spring crops. We're well underway in terms of the spring barley harvest, I suppose, in particular. And maybe it's a little ways to go, maybe for some of the spring wheats and maybe even some of the spring oats. But what are you seeing so far in terms of that spring harvest?
Just try to get an update there from the local merchants to see what the feeling is on the ground, but probably in around 70%. So we're well on our way there. This will be a big spring barley growing area here in this part of the world. So just has been stop-start with the weather conditions. A few good days there last Friday and Saturday, hot sunnier weather. People were able to make up a bit of ground, but the days are getting shorter and kind of damp, mistier days are reducing growers' ability to get through the acres, with the prevailing weather. But at the moment, I would think with what's been harvested so far, we're probably estimating the average yield to be around 3 tons an acre. But it's early days yet. Growers are kind of pleasantly surprised with how the yields are compared to how the crops looked earlier in the year. There was maybe a little bit of worry earlier in the year, and we saw a lot of the effects of cultivations and suboptimal conditions in a lot of places and patchiness. But yields of straw pretty good, probably averaging 8 to 9 bales an acre, but as low as 6 and as high as 11, we'll say. But a big help this year compared to last year is that all the crops are standing. Crops have ripened a bit more slowly, and it's helping growers to pick off fields as they're coming ripe. So there's very little losses to lodging and brackling as they're coming ripe now. Small bit of brackling coming into it, and a lot of malting varieties down this direction would be testament to that. But so moisture is coming in around probably 20% on average, but small few rejections for moistures, but that's to be sort of a roundup with a spring barley.
And you mentioned malting. Is it most of it making the spec?
Yes, low proteins, I suppose. In terms of quality, proteins are probably a little bit lower this year, and quite low in places as low as 7 and 8%. Some not really rejections on the small few on quality, like maybe if you had a bad headland or a tram line going into a trailer, but people were probably a bit anxious to get harvesting done, so there was certainly rejections based on moisture as well this year. But I know a lot of people are quite happy they're filling their malting contracts so far.
And would it be fair to say that there's very little of the spring wheat or spring oats harvested? Or
spring oats is just starting, but some good early reports. Crops are looking very promising. No spring wheat to report on yet.
Ciara, thanks very much for that. John, we'll go back in order again. John, in terms of the spring harvest with farmers in Wexford, what's that looking like?
Again, probably north of the county, Michael, up around Enniscorthy is probably a little bit more progressed, in around 50%. Whereas you come down south of the county, is probably that little bit less. We're probably something in around 40% progressed. There was a lot of progress made over the weekend. And again, guys were cutting crops, but they were getting into fields as crops were just ripe and just fit. So they're on top of their workload. But at this point in time, most crops are fit at this stage. So the bulk of the work is in front of guys there at the moment. And if we can get an agreeable bit of weather, there'll be a lot of work done over the next week or that.
And what's any indication on yield so far?
Again, barley, Michael. Again, it's a bit like Ciara's story. People are pleasantly surprised. Crops have yielded an awful lot better than what they looked earlier on. So again, depending on where you are, if you're out around Screen or Blackwater and lighter soils, guys, there's reports of as low as 2.5 ton, but there's also reports of over 3.5 ton as well, with the average running probably in around 3 ton or a sliver with it. So yields are actually very good. Guys are very happy with yields. Again, in terms of the malt end of it, again, there's rejections on malt as well. The bulk of it is make malt, but earlier on there would have been some rejections on moistures. So would have had guys that would have been over the 21.5% moisture, so there would have been rejections on that. I suppose people were just anxious to get stuff cut, but they didn't meet the mall spec as a result of it. Bushels as well, Michael. Some stuff was failed on bushels. Like there's some reports of bushels as low as 58 and 59. But again, it wouldn't be the norm. And again, some stuff has failed as well as a result of skint grains as well. With one, but it's mainly associated with one variety.
Okay, so yeah, so it's looking pretty good pretty good all around. And just to round it up there, John, in terms of spring oats, any of that done, or I presume no spring wheat done yet?
No spring wheat done, Michael. Obviously, spring oats. There's a very small area of spring oats cut. Spring oats really is only common fit, the majority of it. But again, some very good reports. One grower that's cut all of his spring oats, and it's done 2 3/4 tons, but the yield potential, it wouldn't have been as attractive as a lot of other crops. One other grower that's actually cut in around 3 3/4 tons of spring oats, but generally the potential in spring oats is very good.
That's great to hear. At least there's some good news there along the way. Conor, is there any good news up with you in terms of some of the spring crops coming off?
Yeah, there's Michael following on the same trend as Ciara and John. There the spring barley is doing quite well. We would have started last Saturday week with lads with big acreage to get through. Would have started cutting there. There were high enough moistures, between 21-24%, but they kind of got the ball rolling. Then the middle of last week, the real spring barley harvest got going, where a lot of growers got out cutting. And the range there from 2.7 to 3.4, the first kind of initial reports came in. Look, they're doing well. They're bushing well. There's some pet fields they're even after veg, and they're doing up on 4 ton. For a crop that was kind of such a short growing season, it's doing really well. Straw, I suppose it's 40 or 50% of it is baled. Last Sunday wasn't a great day for straw, and if we had got a good day, a lot of the straw would have been baled. That had been cut. Yeah, look, we've good moistures up last weekend. Saturday there was barley doing 3.5 ton at 15.5% moisture. So it's a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, and it'll kind of get rid of some of the sour taste from the winter wheat up in the northeast.
Just in terms of Conor, just in terms of straw volumes, Ciara mentioned something like 8 to 9 bales an acre of 4x4s on some of the spring barleys. Is it a similar story with yourselves?
Yeah, similar. We're probably 2 to 3 bales probably ahead of the winter barley, believe it or not, in some places, Michael. Okay. What it's doing, like it's and straw quality is good. It's a pity, as I said, last weekend there was a lot of straw on the ground last Saturday and Sunday, and just today, the Chem Sunday, there was a lot of it due to be baled Sunday, but balers couldn't move. It wasn't a good enough day to bale.
And Conor, how much of the spring barley, I suppose the spring crops maybe in total, how much of that's kind of left to be done, or what's the total harvest kind of completion rate to date? Are you 60-70% there?
We're probably a bit more. There's maybe 10% winter wheat still there in pockets, and lads kind of if winter wheat, they'd leave winter wheat to go with spring barley in case it starts brackling, the head starts dropping off. So that there's about 10% winter wheat left, and I'd say we've about 20% to 30% of the spring barley left. Oats is only coming fit, like John said, and there's very little spring wheat. 1 or 2 lads tried a bit of spring wheat. But it's not fit. It's not fit to cut.
One last question I'm going to kind of pose to all three of you, because I certainly, but all of the areas there's a certain amount of spring barley left to be cut, and it was probably the stuff that was sown that little bit later. Maybe to you, Conor, first. Do you think that will hold up in terms of yield? And often it doesn't, and probably tends to drag down the averages. But where do you think that might come in at?
Oh, I think it will, Michael. Like the potential is there. The crops look good across the board. So you couldn't really pick out the late ones. Like some of the actual later sown crops have been cut already. Just the ground we're in, and they're still doing over 3 ton.
Okay, so still hope there, John.
Probably, I'd say from the difference between the earlier sown crops and the later sown crops is bushel itself. So the later sown crops bushel seems to have slipped a little bit with them. But yields probably have slipped that little bit as well, but they're still holding up very well, Michael. You're still floating in around 3 ton or a sliver weight. So again, like for late sown barley, like if you're to look into the crystal ball and back in May and say you were going to be cutting 3 ton with a May sown crop of spring barley, you would have been surprised. But Yeah, things have turned out well for farmers, really, being honest with you. And again, a lot of us making malts, so you're seeing the bonus out of that as well in terms of price.
An unusual year. Wouldn't happen every year. But Ciara, I'll ask you the final question on that. Where do you think the last of it will end up?
Yeah, I'd reiterate what the lads would say, and I guess it's down to the weather. If the crops kind of stay standing and people can get them through the combines will be the big determining factor, whether they achieve the 3 tons an acre and keep up the standard.
Okay. Listen, on that really positive note, I want to thank you, Ciara, John and Conor. Delighted you could join me. It's great to get that update because look, no matter which way it goes, people should be recording their own yields on a field by field basis to get their own average of the field, not of what was harvested necessarily, and comparing that and I suppose picking out how they can improve for next year. So look, it's great to get that bit of a roundup across the country because every place does vary just that little bit. So again, thanks very much, guys.
Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for this week. And my thanks to Conor, Ciara and John for joining me on the show. Just to remind you, next week we'll be holding the Teagasc Crops Forum. The event will be held next Wednesday, September the 11th in the Cadine Hotel, Newbridge, with a kick-off at 2 p.m. This year we're focusing on planning rotations, early planting of winter barley, and also a specific focus on soils. Given the battering soils have taken over the past 24 months, we have a great lineup to discuss soil remediation and also soil drainage. So if you've had a patchy crop in 2024 due to wet spots, then this is a conference to attend. Entry is free, and this is an in-person only event, so we won't be transmitting it on Zoom. So that's it for this week. If you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.